one of the main kind of problem we're trying to address is the problem of global connectivity. So I'll try to kind of explain to you what we mean by that, and then try to give you, some highlights of some of the research direction in this area, in particular the usefulness of optical wireless communication to address this problem of global connectivity. So, probably you're all familiar with this great success story that wireless communication has been over the last 5 decades. So if you look at the trend and the number of mobile subscribers over the years, you see this kind of increasing number of subscribers, and these subscribers are not anymore just kind of mobile users, but also machines. And correspondingly, you see on the right-hand side of the slide that the amount of data that we are kind of communicating wirelessly is also increasing exponentially, and this obviously putting some capacity limits on wireless networks. So this led to this kind of revolution over the last, let's say, 4 or 5 decades. So we went through different generations of wireless communication systems. So 1G was about analog voice. 2G was the time where we moved into digital kind of voice communication towards the end of the 90s, where in the 2G era, we start using SMS and email. 2000 was the time where we start using mobile phone for internet browsing. We are now towards the end of 4G era, where we are essentially enjoying multi-megabit data transmission and internet browsing capabilities. And people are starting talking about 5G from deployment perspective. From a research perspective, we have been working on 5G for the last 10 years. But from a deployment, people are talking about 5G with the kind of main feature of 5G, which are enhanced mobile broadband, massive machine-type communication, and ultra-reliable low-latency communication. So now, it's the time to start talking about 6G, at least from a research perspective. And as you see in this slide, there has been many forums that have been established over the recent month trying to talk about what 6G is going to be about. And as you may suspect, like some of the kind of important application that 6G is going to look at is like an improved version of what 5G has been researching for the last 10 years or so, like super enhanced mobile broadband, gigabit per second capability transmission over wireless channels, vehicle to X, meaning by that vehicle to vehicle communication, vehicle to infrastructure communication, e-health kind of application, virtual reality, augmented reality applications. These are some of the kind of trendy, fancy application that 6G is going to be talking about. So I actually have a paper with some of the colleagues on this topic. This is speculative, but that's the time to talk about 6G because we are at the early stage trying to kind of think of what 6G can provide, and you are all free to go and look at and read at this paper. But if you want to look at it from a different perspective, and this morning we had 2 interesting talks and discussion by Dr. Cindy and Dr. Dejani about the so-called Sustainable Development Goal of United Nations. These are very noble goals that we are collectively trying to kind of achieve by 2030. So it is expected that these goals will be playing a big role in the development of 6G. Let me try to be more specific. If you look at previous generation of wireless communication system, the main driver was the MNOs. MNOs are the mobile network operator, which means that the main driver was a financial driver, a business driver. Now it's expected that beyond that, we are going to try to look at some other important aspects, which are digital inclusion, and I'll explain that as we follow, and safety and security, on the top of the classical things that we have been looking at over the last 40 years, which is improved efficiency from a power perspective, from an energy perspective, from a spectrum perspective, to be more profitable. So we are going to go and try to be beyond that and be more inclusive. So what do we mean by that? If you look at the map of the world and try to ask yourself, how is the world connected? Are we all connected in the same way? you will see that there is a big inequalities. There are countries where the level of connectivity is below 10 or 20%, whereas there are some other countries where the connectivity is much higher. So actually, even in the most developed countries, like let's say Sweden, Finland, Norway, they suffer from the so-called digital gap. Maybe 10%, 15% of these population, specifically in rural areas, remote areas, are still not connected. So that's one of the main objectives of 6G, is to try to connect the remaining 4 billion, or more than half of world population. Now, what is the reason for this gap? The main reason is an economical reason. Essentially, the way these cellular companies or mobile national operator work, they work based on a model of investment which is on return on investment. So they buy the spectrum, it costs a lot of money, they have equipment, and so basically they invest a lot, and they expect to get the return on investment by going and deploying their networks in highly populated, highly dense areas, so that they get back their money from people, having their monthly subscription into their phone services or mobile services. Obviously, if you are trying to provide service to remote areas where basically the population are very scattered, like villages and rural areas, it doesn't make much sense to lay hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers of fiber optics to reach, few hundred people that are scattered. So you cannot get back your money. So one of the main reasons is this kind of notion of ruralness or scattered populations. The other aspect is to have reliable communication networks, you need to have also a reliable power grid. And it's not always available in many of these regions. So basically, the idea of 6G, 5G and 6G, which is targeting smart cities, has to evolve, trying to go towards rather smart environments, including smart villages and smart rural areas. And why this is important? Because actually, if you have this digital divide, and you can look at this negative cycle that I'm drawing on the right-hand side here, you see that essentially it's a very negative cycle. If you don't have a good infrastructure, so people are not attracted by your region, and essentially you go into even further kind of lag behind from a digital divide perspective, and you miss many opportunities for health, education that can be done remotely if connectivity is available. So there are many solutions to solve this problem. In particular, one of the key issues is the backhaul, is how you reach these remote areas without having to lay fiber or cables, because it's quite expensive, as I mentioned earlier. So some of the solution, and companies like Google and Facebook are quite active in this connectivity era, is to use the so-called high-altitude platform, like drones, like balloons, to provide this aerial kind of connectivity. Some other area of research that are picking up quite nicely, and probably you heard about that in the recent news, is all this constellation of low Earth orbit satellites. So you probably heard about OneWeb or Telsat LEO. These are basically constellation of hundreds, sometimes thousands of satellites that are going to bring connectivity to every single point on Earth. So some of these kind of research direction are quite interesting, and many of us in the wireless area are getting into these topics. In particular, one interesting technology is to use the so-called very high throughput satellites. So these are satellites that on one hand have multiple RF beams that can connect multiple remote areas or airplanes or crews, and on the other side, like a very high bandwidth feeder that can be using the optical spectrum or an optical feeder, and because of the cloud, you may have to rely on multiple of these optical feeder or optical gateways to create some form of diversity. So this is one of the research direction we are looking at over the last few months in my research group. So once you are on the ground, essentially to distribute internet in these rural areas, once you have this aerial backhaul, you can rely on TV towers and essentially the VHF, UHF spectrum, which is like prime spectrum to reach high coverage in the order of tens of kilometers, and by that you can distribute internet or connectivity in a very remote area once the backhaul is established, or you can establish very high throughput mesh networks using kind of this directive mesh networks as illustrated in this graph. So just to remain within the time allocated to me, one interesting topic that many of us are investigating is the usefulness of the optical part of the spectrum, which is unlicensed, free, provide super high speed connectivity for many of these applications. So for example, many of the satellites, inter-satellite links are established using optical wireless communication links. If you want to have high-speed backhaul in the ground, you can use also FSO or free space optics. And these are some of the research directions that are being kind of researched in my group and in many other research groups interested by these topics. So in conclusion, what I would like to say is, if you solve this problem of digital gap, or if you bring connectivity even to these remote areas, and directly we are helping all of us, including those of us who live in a highly populated, highly dense areas, because we may lose connectivity anytime because of natural disasters or, like terrorist attacks or things like that that make you lose your network overnight. As an example, for example, there was a hurricane that hit the island of Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, and it was thanks to the Google Loon project, one of these kind of balloon temporary network that was deployed there, that essentially connectivity was offered there for a couple of weeks until network was established. And sometimes connectivity in emergency situation is quite critical to be able to kind of help people and establish the first aid. So with that, I would like to thank you. If you are interested by this topic, you can go to the website of my research group. We have a few publications on this topic, and I will be happy to take any question on this topic. Thank you.